America embraced the gentle optimism of John Denver, but as his songs went everywhere, his private warnings grew louder, and no one really listened. Born Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., drifting between Air Force bases and craving stability, he was handed a guitar at 11 and a brand by 29. But when Denver called the public version of himself not real, the world looked away. Where did that denial lead? Henry John Deutschendorf Jr. was born on December 31, 1943, in Roswell, New Mexico, at the edge of a military airfield where his father, Henry Sr., known as Dutch, flew missions for the United States Air Force. The world he entered was defined by movement and discipline. By the time Henry was 5 years old, the family had already packed up and left the desert for a base in Arizona. Not long after, Alabama became home, then Texas, and for a time, Japan. Each new posting meant a new house, a new school, and the uneasy feeling of being a stranger in someone else's world. The rhythm of packing and unpacking boxes became as familiar as the sound of jets overhead. His father ran the household with the same precision he brought to his flights. Schedules were strict, beds made tight, shoes shined to a mirror gloss. There was little room for mistakes and even less for softness. Henry learned early that his father's approval was something to be earned, not given. He remembered the sting of a sharp word, the silence that followed a misstep. The message was clear. Emotions were to be managed, not displayed. The rules of the house were simple, but affection was complicated, always just out of reach. In the middle of this constant uprooting, a single act of kindness offered Henry a sense of home. When he turned 11 years old, his grandmother arrived with a battered Gibson guitar, its wood worn smooth by decades of hands before his. Built in 1910, the guitar was more than a gift. It was a bridge. Henry's fingers stumbled at first, but the music soon became his anchor. He carried the guitar from base to base, its case scuffed by miles of travel, its sound a comfort in unfamiliar rooms. In later years, he would recall how the guitar gave him a way to belong. At each new school, he could play a song, and for a moment, the walls came down. He wasn't just the new kid. He was someone with a story to share. The guitar did more than fill the silence left by his father's distance. It gave Henry a way to reach people, to make friends in places where he had none. He learned that a gentle smile and a familiar tune could turn suspicion into welcome. The need to be liked, to fit in, became second nature. It wasn't a performance. It was a way to survive the loneliness that came with every move. Dutch never understood the pull of music. He wanted his son to follow a path of order and predictability, not the uncertain road of a performer. Henry felt the pressure to conform, the quiet disappointment when he chose the guitar over the rule book. But the music let him say what he couldn't voice at home. Every transfer, every new address, added another layer of adaptability. The roots stayed shallow, but the longing for connection grew deeper. By the time he left home, the habits were set. Please others, keep the peace, hide the need. Years later, when the world saw only the smile, few realized how much of it had been shaped by a boy searching for acceptance, where approval and affection always seemed just one song away. By the early 1970s, the music industry had a plan for Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., now known as John Denver. RC. Executives saw more than a singer, they saw a brand. Under the direction of his first major manager, Jerry Weintraub, Denver's career strategy shifted sharply toward television. Weintraub, a former concert promoter, believed critics could be bypassed entirely if Denver was delivered straight into America's living rooms. He pressed RCA for a national campaign, not just radio play. In 1971, RCA reissued Take Me Home, Country Roads, and poured resources into a focused push, starting in Denver, Colorado itself, before rolling out to the rest of the country. The song soared and the formula was set. Television became the centerpiece. Booking memos from the period show a relentless schedule: daytime talk shows, evening variety hours, holiday specials. RCA and Weintraub worked closely with network bookers to ensure Denver's presence was constant and consistent. By 1974, he was headlining his own specials, John Denver and Friends, Rocky Mountain Christmas, and guest hosting major events like the Grammy Awards. The ratings validated the approach. In 1974 and 1975, his network specials drew millions of viewers, cementing him as a fixture of family programming. The packaging was deliberate. RCA's art departments and stylists reinforced the image: long blonde hair, wire-rimmed glasses, embroidered Western shirts, always outdoors or with a guitar in hand. Press releases described him as wholesome, gentle, and safe, America's favorite boy next door. Merchandising followed suit. Posters, songbooks, and licensed products all traded on the same themes. Behind the scenes, contracts and booking agreements quietly favored content that was apolitical and reassuring. Network standards and advertisers preferred nostalgia, nature, and love songs over anything that might provoke controversy. Producers pre-cleared monologues and song selections, steering him away from material that could disrupt the brand. Denver's management leaned into this comfort zone, but he did not always. Even as the machine built around him grew stronger, early cracks appeared. In interviews from the mid-1970s, Denver bristled at being described as safe or corny. He pointed out that his songs dealt with loneliness, loss, and environmental destruction, subjects far from simple or saccharine. In one televised segment, he interrupted a host mid-introduction to clarify that his music was not just about sunshine and smiles. He insisted that there was more depth, more risk than people wanted to see. These moments were not hidden. They aired on national television, were printed in magazines, and sometimes drew awkward laughter or quick pivots from interviewers eager to return to the script. Still, the machinery rolled on. RCA's 1974 to 1975 booking memos reveal an explicit television-first strategy with instructions to prioritize family-friendly programming and avoid venues that might complicate the image. Denver's own attempts to widen the frame, to show frustration, ambition, or anger were often met with polite dismissal. The industry had found what worked, and the public seemed to want the same thing. For Denver, the persona that had once felt like a solution was becoming a contract, one that was easier to sign than to escape. The first warning signs were not buried, they were broadcast, spoken aloud, then quietly ignored as the world kept tuning in for comfort. John Denver and Annie Martell married in 1967, years before the world knew his name. Their early life together was marked by hope and long stretches of quiet, but as Denver's career accelerated, the distance between them grew. By the mid-1970s, his touring schedule kept him away from home for months at a time. Annie often found herself raising their adopted children, Zachary and Anna Kate, largely on her own, while John's absence became routine. The house filled with reminders of his success, platinum records, fan mail, stacks of contracts. But at the kitchen table, Annie faced the growing silence alone. Denver's autobiography, Take Me Home, offers an unflinching account of what happened behind closed doors. He describes how the pressures of fame and the expectations attached to his public image seeped into every corner of their marriage. The man, celebrated on television as gentle and wholesome, struggled with anger and frustration that rarely surfaced in public. He writes about drinking too much, about infidelity, about needing to escape the very life he had built. The more he was boxed in by the persona of America's nicest star, the more volatile he became at home. These are not private rumors, they are confessions written in his own voice. One incident stands out. During a heated argument, he took a chainsaw and cut their marital bed in half. The act was deliberate, a physical expression of a marriage coming apart, a gesture that made the damage impossible to ignore. Denver admitted to other acts of violence as well, including choking Annie in a separate episode. These were not tabloid inventions. They were admissions, published in his own words years before his death. Denver linked these outbursts to a sense of being trapped by fame, by obligations, and by the gap between his true self and the character he played for the world. The word that follows this part of the record is violence. Substance misuse became a way to dull the tension. Denver wrote about abusing alcohol and drugs, using them to manage the stress of constant travel and the demands of an audience that wanted him to remain endlessly cheerful. The more he tried to live up to the expectations of his fans and his industry, the more he lost control in private. Annie, who had once inspired Annie's song, became a witness to the unraveling. She rarely spoke publicly about the worst moments, but her later interviews confirmed the emotional cost of living with a man who could be both loving and unpredictable. The warmth that drew her in was still there, but it was now shadowed by resentment and regret. The pattern is clear. The theme is substance and strain. The strain was not just personal, it was structural. Denver's attempts to find purpose outside the confines of his image, especially through environmental activism, were shaped by the same forces that were tearing his marriage apart. The home he returned to after each tour was no longer a refuge, but a battleground between the man he felt he was and the man the world expected him to be. The warning signs, the anger, the violence, the confessions were visible, even as the public kept seeing only the smile. For Annie and the children, the cost of the boxed persona was measured in broken trust and fractured days, long before the headlines ever caught up. In 1976, John Denver and Thomas Crum founded the WinStar Foundation on 1,000 acres near Snowmass, Colorado. The mission was ambitious. They aimed to bring together science, education, and grassroots activism to help people live more sustainably. WinStar was not a celebrity side project. It ran year-round programs, built demonstration gardens, hosted environmental symposia, and partnered with groups like NASA and the National Wildlife Federation. Denver's vision for WinStar was clear in his own words. He called for a peaceful and sustainable future, urging everyone to take personal responsibility for the planet. A year later, Denver co-founded the Hunger Project with Werner Erhard and Robert Fuller. The goal was to end world hunger, not just through charity, but by challenging the systems that kept people hungry. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter appointed Denver to the President's Commission on World Hunger. He wrote and performed the song "I Want to Live" as the Commission's theme, and he took the stage at the Music for UNICEF concert in 1979, donating royalties to support children worldwide. These were not passing interests. Denver poured time, money, and reputation into these causes. WinStar alone would eventually cost nearly $2 million a year to operate, a burden his own manager called unsustainable. As Denver's activism grew more visible, the response from the industry and the press changed. The same outlets that once celebrated his gentle optimism began to treat his seriousness with skepticism, and sometimes with mockery. Headlines from the late 1970s and early 1980s often framed his environmental speeches as naive or self-righteous. Music critics who once praised his sincerity now called him preachy. At the Country Music Association Awards, jokes about tree hugging and granola replaced applause. Television producers who previously booked him for holiday specials and variety hours started to hesitate, wary that his earnestness might alienate sponsors or audiences. Booking logs from this period show a decline in primetime appearances, and interviews reveal a new pattern. Hosts would introduce him as the singer who wants to save the world, a setup for gentle ridicule before returning to nostalgia. Denver felt the shift. In interviews, he spoke with more urgency and less patience. He described WinStar as a moral obligation, not a branding exercise. Former WinStar trustees recall how he insisted on bringing scientists, activists, and young people together, even as donors and publicists urged him to scale back. Board minutes from the early 1990s show mounting financial strain, but Denver refused to let go, arguing that the work mattered more than the cost. The backlash was not just about ratings or reviews. It became a cultural penalty for taking himself and his causes seriously. The nice guy who once reassured America now made some people uncomfortable. Instead of expanding what John Denver could mean, activism narrowed his lane. The image that had once opened every door now closed some of them. Through WinStar, the Hunger Project, and a steady stream of speeches and benefits, Denver tried to turn his platform into a force for change. The public and the industry responded by tightening the contract. The warning signs were there. The more he tried to use his fame for something urgent, the more the world wanted him to stick to comfort. For Denver, the cost of caring out loud was real, measured in bookings lost, headlines turned sour, and a legacy that for years seemed easier to flatten than to understand. By 1994, John Denver had stopped hiding behind the image that once made him famous. His memoir, Take Me Home, offered a blunt account of the gap between the public persona and the private man, his anger, his loneliness, and the mistakes that shaped him. The book arrived more than a decade after RCA, the label that built its brand around Denver, dropped him in 1983. Since then, he had drifted from one small label to the next, each deal shorter and less certain. He spoke openly about his frustration. New songs he believed in, but no major record deal, no radio play, no chart presence. 5 albums released in one summer went largely unnoticed. The hits that once filled stadiums now served as anchors for nostalgia tours, while his new material struggled to find an audience willing to listen. Bill Danoff and Taffy Nivert, who co-wrote Take Me Home Country Roads, saw the change up close. Danoff remembered late-night talks on tour buses, Denver wrestling with the reality that his name had become both a ticket and a trap. Nivert recalled how, by the 1980s, set lists were shaped as much by promoters and TV producers as by the band. They wanted the old songs, the safe choices, and they discouraged anything unfamiliar or too revealing. Denver tried to push back, reworking arrangements, inviting new musicians, adding spoken introductions that explained where he was now. But the applause always swelled for the classics and faded for the rest. Denver's own tour notes from the early 1990s show a man determined to move forward. Set lists balanced Annie's Song, Rocky Mountain High, and Sunshine on My Shoulders with lesser-known tracks about loss, environmental urgency, and personal reckoning. In the margins, he wrote about wanting to share what was real, not just what was expected. Yet the structure of the shows rarely changed. Booking agents wary of disappointing audiences leaned on the familiar. One former manager later admitted that Denver's efforts to reinvent himself were often quietly reined in by the business side, who saw risk where he saw honesty. The memoir was both confession and challenge. Denver wrote candidly about substance abuse, failed marriages, and feeling like a stranger to his own reputation. He called out an industry that rewarded simplicity and punished complexity. But even as he revealed himself, the commercial world stayed indifferent. The memoir sold modestly. Radio programmers and late-night hosts stuck to the script, John Denver as nostalgia, not as a man still searching. Danoff described the exhaustion that followed each failed attempt to break the mold. Nivert, reflecting years later, said the industry wanted the comfort of the past, not the discomfort of change. With doors closing in music and television, Denver turned more and more to the AIR. Aviation became an escape from the roles he could not shed on the ground. Yet the struggle to be heard on his own terms remained unresolved, his warnings lingering in the margins, visible to anyone willing to look beyond the chorus of greatest hits. This moment is not the end of the story. It is a reset, candid and unfinished. The attempts to reinvent and the retreats into flight tell the same story, the story of a man trying to shape his life when the world kept assigning him a role. John Denver earned his pilot's license in the mid-1970s, but the story of flight in his life began much earlier, in the shadow of his father's uniform. Henry Dutch Deutschendorf was a decorated Air Force colonel, a test pilot who flew bombers in 2 wars and demanded precision in everything, especially in the cockpit. For a boy growing up on military bases, the sound of engines overhead was as familiar as his father's measured voice. Yet flying was not just a family legacy, it was a language between them, one that offered its own kind of intimacy and tension. When Denver first took an interest in aviation as an adult, it was Dutch who insisted on teaching him the fundamentals. Family members recall hours spent together in small planes, Dutch guiding his son through checklists and emergency drills, sometimes with a patience that surprised those who had seen him at home. In interviews, Denver described those lessons as both a gift and a test. His father's way of showing love through rigor, of letting his son earn approval by mastering something dangerous and exacting. The cockpit, became the rare place where the rules were clear, where affection was measured in trust and technical skill. Denver's pilot logbooks show a steady accumulation of hours through the late 1970s and the 1980s. He flew Cessnas, Learjets, and vintage biplanes. He bought, restored, and flew a series of aircraft, each one representing a different chapter in his search for autonomy. For a man who spent so much of his life being managed by record labels, by television producers, by the expectations of millions, flight offered a realm with no script. The sky was a place where he could set his own course, where the only contract was with the laws of physics. But the freedom of flight came with its own risk. Aviation requires constant vigilance, and even experienced pilots face dangers that cannot be softened by fame or nostalgia. Denver's enthusiasm sometimes outpaced his caution. Friends and family recall him pushing the limits, flying in marginal weather, experimenting with new aircraft, logging hours in challenging conditions. Dutch, ever the instructor, warned his son about the dangers of overconfidence and the need for meticulous preparation. Their conversations, captured in Denver's memoir and in family interviews, reveal a dynamic that was both loving and fraught. A father offering hard-earned wisdom, a son seeking both approval and independence. By the time Denver was piloting his own planes across the Rockies and out over the Pacific, flying had become more than a hobby. It was a sanctuary, a domain where he was not John Denver the icon, but simply a pilot responsible for his own fate. The cockpit was the one place he could escape the persona that had boxed him in on the ground. Yet that same craving for escape, so central to his identity, carried the seeds of danger. The technical discipline his father taught him was always in tension with the restless urge to break free, to chase the horizon without looking back. In the end, the story of John Denver's flying is not just about freedom or risk, but about the complicated inheritance between father and son, a legacy of control, longing, and the ever-present possibility that one moment of distraction could change everything. The official record of John Denver's final flight begins with a checklist and ends with a chain of small, traceable decisions. On October 12, 1997, Denver took off from Monterey Peninsula Airport in a Rutan Long-EZ, a home-built experimental aircraft he had purchased just weeks earlier. The plane's fuel system was not standard. Its selector valve, which controlled which tank fed the engine, had been relocated by the builder to a spot behind the pilot's left shoulder. NTSB investigators measured the distance from the seat to the selector and found that Denver, strapped in with his shoulder harness, could not reach it. To switch tanks in flight, a pilot had to loosen or release the harness, twist around, and reach back, actions that divided attention and compromised control. The selector was out of reach when he was secured in the seat. Denver had not refueled before the flight. Maintenance records and witness statements show he had already performed several touch-and-go landings that afternoon, burning fuel from the selected tank. Calculations in the NTSB docket indicate that when he left the airport and turned out over Monterey Bay, the tank in use was nearly empty. Witnesses along the shoreline described hearing the engine sputter and pop, then watched as the Long-EZ banked right and dropped its nose toward the water. There was no distress call, no mayday. The sequence lasted only seconds. Investigators reconstructed the most likely scenario. As the engine lost power, Denver attempted to switch tanks. Reaching for the selector required loosening his restraints and twisting his body. In that moment, the NTSB found he likely applied right rudder by accident, causing the aircraft to yaw and roll sharply. At low altitude, there was no time or space to recover from the resulting stall and spin. The accident unfolded in a matter of heartbeats. The board's final report named the primary cause, the pilot's diversion of attention from flying the airplane while attempting to manipulate a poorly placed fuel selector. The design flaw, moving the selector out of easy reach, was a contributing factor. So was inadequate pre-flight planning. Denver had not fully practiced the fuel system's operation on this specific aircraft, and he had not refueled before departure. The board also cited a lack of transition training to this experimental type. Toxicology tests performed by the FAA Civil Aeromedical Institute returned negative for alcohol and all screened drugs. No substances were found in Denver's system, while his pilot's medical certificate had been withdrawn months earlier due to a history of DUIs. The board found no evidence of medical incapacity or impairment. The absence of a valid medical certificate made the flight illegal, but it played no role in the mechanics of the crash itself. The NTSB docket is clear. The accident was not a mystery, nor was it the result of reckless flying or substance use that day. It was a sequence of human factors, design decisions, and a moment's distraction at a critical time. The facts point to a man trying to solve a problem in the air, undone by a cockpit layout that left no margin for error. News of John Denver's death broke before sunset on October 12, 1997. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Anchors described him as the voice of the American landscape, a gentle troubadour who made the world feel smaller and safer. Headlines leaned on the familiar, singer of Leaving on a Jet Plane Dies in Plane Crash, Rocky Mountain High Star Gone, America's favorite folk singer lost in tragic accident. Television segments looped old concert footage, the chorus of his most famous songs swelling behind images of the Monterey coast. The irony of the crash was irresistible to editors. Song titles became punchlines. Local and national broadcasts opened with lines like, "He wrote Leaving on a jet plane and now he is gone," or "He soared with sunshine on my shoulders, but today John Denver's light has faded." In the rush to memorialize, the narrative narrowed. Decades of environmental advocacy, public fights for world hunger relief, and his work with the President's Commission on World Hunger largely vanished from early coverage. There were no mentions of Windstar, the foundation he built in Colorado, or the millions he spent trying to make sustainability more than a slogan. Instead, the story returned to the comfort zone, the smiling face, the acoustic guitar, the soundtrack of a simpler, kinder era. News tickers scrolled through his greatest hits while skipping the years he spent battling for causes that rarely made the charts. Even his Senate testimony against music censorship, where he challenged the idea that he was too safe to be dangerous, went unmentioned. The pattern repeated across print and broadcast. Obituaries in major newspapers stacked nostalgia atop nostalgia, calling Denver the singer who made America feel at home, the voice of the Rockies, the man who brought sunshine to millions. Friends and colleagues who spoke up in those first interviews were asked about favorite memories, not about the years when Denver was mocked for caring too much or lost bookings for refusing to play along. The discomfort, the anger, the warnings, none of it made the early scripts. Instead, the persona that had boxed him in during life was quickly restored in death, polished and replayed for a grieving public. Within 72 hours, the myth was back in place. The man who had spent years warning that his image was a mask was once again frozen behind it. Newsrooms reached for the easiest story, a gentle star lost too soon, remembered for the songs that made people feel good. Headlines that could have asked hard questions about risk, about activism, about the cost of being everyone's comfort blanket chose instead to keep the story simple. The warning signs faded from view, replaced by a familiar smile and the echo of a chorus everyone already knew by heart. This shift mattered because the early framing shapes what listeners believe about a life. By foregrounding the safe, familiar version, the media erased the thread that linked his public persona to the private pressure he described in interviews. Those interviews existed. They were aired, printed, recorded, but they were dismissed, laughed off, or ignored. The result was a single ending that did not fit the long unfolding tension of his career. Over time, the omissions became a form of erasure. His activism was treated as a footnote rather than a through line. His friction with the public image was treated as an oddity rather than evidence of a contract that had been written for him. The man and the mask were separated once again, and the mask lasted longer. If we want to understand what was ignored, we have to return to the warning signs that were spoken out loud and listen to them as part of the story. The archive contains those moments. When they are played back in sequence, the narrative stops feeling like a sudden tragedy and starts to look like a pressure cooker, a repeated narrowing of possibility until the persona finally hardened. In that sense, the true legacy is neither saint nor cautionary tale, but human. The smile was real, so was the struggle. And the most important question is this: Not did he deserve to be mourned, but did we, as a country and as a press, lose the chance to hear him when he was trying to say who he really was while he was still alive. Today, celebrity personas are engineered and consumed faster than ever, but the cost of sincerity remains the same. When public expectation hardens into myth, the real person risks being erased, sometimes while still speaking out loud. The evidence is not hidden, it is ignored. And as new voices chase authenticity, John Denver's story warns that even the clearest signals can vanish in the noise. What do you see, and what do you choose to hear?